During World War II, there was an 8-month period in the UK known as the Blitz, where the German Luftwaffe would drop bombs all over the cities of Britain. Nearly every night, the people of London would descend into shelters like those set up in the London Underground. The food options down there were limited, but if you were lucky, you could expect some honey biscuits and a bowl of Blitz soup. So thank you to the new film Blitz, streaming on Apple TV Plus November 22nd, for partnering with me on this video as we dine in a bomb shelter, this time on Tasting History. I recently had the good fortune to watch the new film Blitz, directed by Academy Award winner Steve McQueen. And as the title suggests, it takes place during the early days of the Blitz. From September of 1940 through May of 1941, over a dozen cities were bombed, including Coventry, Liverpool, and Birmingham, but perhaps most constant was the bombing of London. And because of this, the government set up a plan to evacuate the children from cities like London to the countryside for relative safety. And this is what happens in the movie Blitz. Saoirse Ronan's character Rita makes the decision to send her son George, played by Elliot Heffernan, to safety in the English countryside. My heart was pounding from the very opening of the film because it actually begins with the bombing of London, and it is intense, and it really doesn't let up until the end. Because while the fictional story of George and Rita trying to find each other is emotional and hopeful, it is set and surrounded by the events of one of the most terrifying periods in history. And so every night in the film, as the German planes drop bombs on London, the characters are forced into the underground shelters for safety. And this, of course, led me to ask the question, what were they eating down there? Well, in the early days, it was basically whatever you brought with you. But very soon, after just a couple weeks, an army of women had been employed to start serving food out of what were known as canteens, or else they would go around the shelters and serve snacks and tea and things like that. And in November of 1940, a reporter from the Evening Standard went down into one of these shelters and talked about what it was like. Tea, cocoa, and soup were brewing in 3 electrically heated 10-gallon boilers. Some of the 6 girl attendants were serving these, others were patrolling the shelter pitches with trays of cakes, buns, apples, chocolate, the prices clearly marked on a notice pinned to their overalls. For 6pence I bought a bun, piece of cake, pack of biscuits, slab of chocolate. So I decided to make 2 of the dishes that would have been available for purchase, soup and biscuits. But because of wartime rationing, which I covered in a video last month, making these required some ingenuity. So I found 2 recipes from the period that could help me along. For the soup, I looked to Gert and Daisy's wartime cookery book, Gert and Daisy being a popular comedy duo at the time. Their recipe is for something fittingly called Blitz soup, and while the recipe itself is very simple, I chose it because 1, the name, and 2, it comes with a little poem. When down to your shelter you flits, it may not be quite like the Ritz. If you drink something warm, you'll come to no harm, and the best soup to drink is the Blitz. P.S. Any vegetables can be used, and you'll find this a very useful soup to take to the shelter if you have to take cover. We hope you don't. Now, as this is a vegetable soup, it would be very ration-friendly, as fresh vegetables were never rationed, and many people were growing them in their home victory gardens. Now, they say you can use any vegetables you like, but they do recommend 1 carrot, 1 turnip, 1 leek or onion, I chose leek, 1 or 2 potatoes, a few bones. I'm using chicken bones because a lot of people were actually raising their own chickens, and because I had a chicken last night. Some celery or celery tops. Then it says 4 tumblerfuls of either stock or water, but it doesn't say how big the tumblers are, so I went with 6 cups of water. About 2 teaspoons of salt and 1 teaspoon of pepper. Then a teaspoon of meat extract or yeast extract. First, wash, peel, and chop all of your vegetables, and then put them into a pot with the salt and pepper and the bones and the water. Bring this to a simmer and then set the lid on. And then the recipe says that you're going to simmer these vegetables for an hour, which frankly seems way too long, unless Gert and Daisy maybe had dentures. But it actually puts me in mind of a quote from the period from the Ministry of Food that said, "No country in the world grows vegetables better than we do, and possibly no country in the world cooks them worse." Then once you've simmered your vegetables, basically to the point of mush, you can add a teaspoon of either yeast extract or meat extract. Stir it in and keep the soup warm while you prepare your honey biscuits. Now, this recipe actually comes from a leaflet from the Ministry of Food, specifically leaflet number 21, Making the Most of the Sugar. This leaflet was filled with recipes which, while they didn't completely replace the sugar, which was being strictly rationed, it showed you how to augment it and stretch that sugar with other sweeteners like dried fruit and treacle and honey, like we're going to use in these honey biscuits, for which you will need 75 grams of margarine, that's a little more than 5 tablespoons, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 tablespoons of honey, a scant 1½ cups or 170 grams of plain flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, and a pinch of salt. First, cream the margarine and the sugar until it's nice and smooth, and then beat in the honey. In a separate bowl, sift in the flour, then whisk in the baking soda, cinnamon, and the salt, and then add that to the margarine mixture and mix until it's just combined. Then turn the dough out onto either a floured surface or a piece of parchment and roll it to about 1/4 inch thick. I like to actually roll it between 2 pieces of parchment because it helps the dough not stick to the roller. Once they're rolled out, cut them into small rounds about 2 inches across, and then set them on a baking sheet and place them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for 10 minutes. Now, eventually, both of these dishes were something that could have been sold in the shelters in the tube stations. But at first, the underground was not even set up as a shelter. In fact, you weren't even allowed in. In the early days, they barred people from entering the underground stations, and they depict this in the film Blitz, and it made me ask, why was this happening? The London Blitz began on September 7, 1940, as 364 bombers of the German Luftwaffe, escorted by 515 fighters, dropped bombs on the city's East End. That night, the East End burned. The dockside was ablaze. It lit up a great part of East and Southeast London. It was a night when London was ringed and stabbed with fire. As the bombs fell, people scrambled to find cover. Some went into private shelters or other underground shelters which had been prepared, but there wasn't enough room for many people, and so they went to the nearest underground station. But when they got there, they were barred from entering. Police actually stopped them from going into the stations even as bombs were falling. Why was this happening? Well, it all turns out that it was due to a man named Sir John Anderson. In October of 1938, as the likelihood of war seemed inevitable, Anderson was put in charge of air raid preparations. His main strategy was to equip people with a sheet metal cylinder that could be partway dug into their gardens at home. It ended up becoming known as an Anderson shelter. All well and good if you lived out in the country or in a large house and you had a garden. Not too practical for most of the people living in London who didn't have a garden, especially in London's poorer East End. Well, because of this, it would just make sense for the government to build a bunch of underground shelters in the city, right? Well, not if you were Sir John Anderson, who in 1938 told the House of Commons that apart from the difficulties and delays involved in any extensive scheme for deep bomb-proof shelters, I do not think we are prepared to adapt our whole civilization so as to compel a large proportion of our people to live and maintain the productive capacity in a troglodyte existence deep underground. I guess he worried that they would become a race of mole people. Actually, it was more that he was worried that they would get too comfortable down there underground and not come up to do work, putting out fires and stuff like that, or work in general. This was something he termed deep shelter mentality. And as late as mid-June of 1940, only months before the bombing started, Anderson said, "I am devoutly thankful that we did not adopt a general policy of providing deep and strongly protected shelters." So due to Anderson's theory of deep shelter mentality, that first night of bombing, the tube stations were completely closed off and people could not get in. But by the second night, people had kind of figured out a way to circumvent this by buying a ticket for the tube as if they were going to ride the train during the day, going down, and just refusing to leave come nightfall. And eventually, people just busted in. They stormed the Liverpool Street station and went downstairs. A similar situation took place on September 14th when 50 workers and their children who had lost their homes in Stepney, the neighborhood where many of the characters from the film live, ended up forcing their way into a shelter underground, but it wasn't one of the tube station shelters, rather it was the private shelter at the Savoy Hotel. Now, despite the government's best efforts to keep people above ground during the bombings, it wasn't long before families from the East End with scraps of bedding jostled West End folks with luncheon baskets and expensive traveling rugs in underground stations in the metropolitan area last night. A woman with 4 children, she nestled the youngest in her arms, said that she and her family had been using the tube as a shelter for more than a week. "It's quiet and comfortable here after the last train goes through," she said. "We cannot hear the guns. We sleep and sleep soundly." Though even weeks into the bombings, the government was still discouraging people from using the tube stations as shelters. The Ministries of Home Security and Transport last night issued an appeal to the good sense of the people, and particularly to able-bodied men, to refrain from using tube stations as air raid shelters, except in case of urgent necessity. If literal bombs falling from the sky do not count as urgent necessity, I don't know what does. Well, eventually the government kind of threw up its hands and were like, fine, and they allowed 79 tube stations to be used as underground shelters under the administration of Admiral Sir Edward Evans, known as London's shelter dictator. Those 79 stations, along with many shelters that were not tube stations, began to be outfitted for continuous use. And he promised shelters for everyone, no queues, season tickets for 1 million nightly shelterers, and heat wherever necessary. Yes, season tickets. You had to have a ticket to use these shelters. You didn't just get to run in when the bombing happened. And the tickets were 1.5 pennies, or about 50 cents today, so it wasn't really about the money as much as about just securing a spot, making sure that there was enough space for everyone in a particular shelter. It was deemed too dangerous to have people laying on the tracks or sleeping on the stairs, which during the early days they absolutely did, so this allowed people to secure a bunk and know that they would have a place when the bombing began. By October and November of 1940, 3-tier bunks were being installed in the tube stations, as well as places to get drinking water and, most importantly, toilets. A significant upgrade from the bucket system used in the early days of the Blitz. This is also when the sale of food began to appear in the shelters because, again, during the early days, you had to bring your own food. There was actually a leaflet put out by the Ministry of Food that made a suggestion of food for your air raid shelter. If possible, hot drinks should be taken into the shelter. If you have a vacuum flask, fill it with hot soup, tea, or coffee. Plain biscuits with a handful of sultanas or a piece of chocolate are most sustaining. So are sandwiches made with cheese, sardine, or canned salmon. Children need plenty of water to drink. Barley sugar is excellent for them. While I was in London last year, I actually met a gentleman who had been a child during the Blitz, and he recalled being sent into their Anderson shelter. They had an Anderson shelter, it wasn't the underground, but he talked about some of the foods that they had, and he actually didn't remember any of the good stuff. What he remembered was that they would have to have cod liver oil and something called viral malt, which was a supplement made from bone marrow. He was not a fan. Now, something I did not think about when I was kind of first starting to research this was how to keep the dust off of the food. Because during this period, buildings which had been around for hundreds of years were collapsing. So the Ministry of Food put out a pamphlet giving instructions for protection from bomb dust. Never leave food uncovered. The thick dust which settles after blast due to a bomb explosion frequently renders food unfit to be eaten. This dust even penetrates cartons and wrapping. Cover any food which is not in boxes or tins with a thick cloth or dust sheet. This will also keep out fine splinters of glass. So in those first weeks, it was up to you to provide, hopefully, dust-free food in the air raid shelters. But by October, in that second month, there were canteens set up, run by 1,000 women with tact, common sense, and ability, who will be issued with red kerchiefs to tie around their heads, red armlets, and rubber aprons, and equipped with an electric urn. From 6:30 to 9:30 every night, they will serve cups of tea, cocoa, and coffee at a penny a cup. Bring your own mugs. And cakes, buns, biscuits, chocolate, apples, meat pies, and sausage rolls. They will patrol the platform with their food trolleys for 3 hours, sleep themselves in specially provided bunks from 9:30 till 5 a.m., serve early morning refreshments till 7 o'clock, then tackle the gigantic task of clearing up the litter. It was actually those early morning refreshments that were the most important, because a lot of people went down to the shelters after work and then stayed there all night, and they had to go straight from the shelter back to work. So they needed something for breakfast, even if it was just a cup of tea or coffee. And so the Ministry of Food had a bunch of coffee stations set up around the different shelters. Coffee stalls roll up to help the shelter crowds. Sugar guarantee, I was told at the ministry today. The coffee stalls are guaranteed adequate supplies of tea, sugar, and other essentials, which they buy through the ordinary trade channels. One of the people running these coffee stalls, along with a number of canteens, was a woman named Miss Edith Gowans, and she had a team of 1,000 young women working for her. They dressed in green overalls and cherry red turbans and served coffee and tea out of long-spouted teapots. Miss Gowans is proud of her long-spouted teapots. They were designed by a London transport official, and they are the shape of an ordinary 2-gallon watering can with a long spout. Miss Gowans and her girls see to the babies' bottles, too. They sterilize them before filling them with milk and water. The great thing about these canteens was that it provided people with food even when they were down in the shelters. The only issue was that it also put a strain on some of the supplies, leading to shortages, especially for things like candy. Canteen demands. Shortage of boiled sweets is due to the enormous increase in demand, as well as to the 50% cut in sugar confectionery. The manager of one big confectionery manufacturer told me the canteens and the shelter people are largely responsible. You will find that most confectionery shops near shelters are sold out almost as soon as they get their supplies. This is because people in the shelters are buying more sweets for sustenance purposes. I love that he calls them shelter people. It's actually a lot nicer than another moniker that some people used to refer to those who did use the shelters. We shelterers at Belsize Park Tube Station are boiling with indignation at the appearance in your column on January 1 of the letter referring to us tube shelterers as yellow and as shelter rats. Yes, there was a portion of the population who considered those people who used the shelters to be cowardly and thought that it was better to just stay in your home hoping it didn't get bombed. Luckily, it does seem that that was a very small minority of the population, because as the days went on, the shelters began to be used more and more, so much so that the government decided to create some permanent shelters called deep-level shelters. 10 were commissioned, though only 8 were fully constructed. Built 30 meters below ground and stretching 400 meters in length, each shelter could accommodate 8,000 people and included permanent bunks, lavatories, medical bays, and 8 canteens in each shelter, which would serve soup, sausage rolls, meat pies, and cakes, along with hot beverages. Though by the time the shelters were finished, the Blitz had actually ended, so they were used mostly for storage throughout the war. It wasn't until 1944, when Germany renewed its attacks, this time with the V-1 and V-2 rockets, that they began being used once again. Now, this second round of attacks near the end of the war led to a renewal of the program of sending children out of the cities into the countryside, often to live with relatives or friends, but even more often to live with complete strangers. They didn't know the people. It was just people letting children into their homes. And it must have been a very difficult decision for parents to make. Yes, you're keeping them safe, but you're also sending your child away to live with someone you don't know for who knows how long, and you don't know that you'll be around when it's time for them to come back. And this is the decision that Saoirse Ronan's character Rita has to make at the beginning of the movie Blitz. Luckily, I don't have to make that kind of decision. I just have to decide whether I want to eat my honey biscuits or my Blitz soup first. And here we are. Blitz soup and honey biscuits as were served in the underground shelters during the London Blitz. So I'm going to start with the Blitz soup, which I gotta say, it smells really good, but it is mush. I mean, it's not, you can still tell that these are vegetables, but they are very, very soft, and some have actually just disintegrated. But here we go. It's actually really good, though. There's a little spice to it. I added a good amount of pepper, I guess. But it is pretty flavorful. Also, I think that yeast extract kind of helps. It's pretty good. The texture is what I have a problem with. I would cook this maybe for like half an hour instead of an hour. An hour, it just makes The vegetables are too well cooked, but the flavor is really nice, and you can imagine that, this would be a wonderful, hearty, warming dish to have in a bomb shelter. Now, when it comes to the honey biscuits, these also smell really good. They smell kind of like graham crackers as they were baking. They turned out very well. They're very flat, but they don't seem too hard. Let's give it a taste. So they're not super sweet because, it's just a little bit of sugar and a little bit of honey, but that really allows the honey flavor to come out. I think you could use a little bit more cinnamon too. They are mild, but they would be perfect to have with a cup of tea or cocoa. And because they're mild, these are the kind of things that you can just sit there and eat like 20 of them mindlessly. They're actually pretty good and really easy to make. These are worth making. Actually, both of these dishes are worth making. The vegetable soup is very simple. These are simple too, but these are something I would actually make. Again, they're quite nice. Anyway, while I was researching this video and going through all these old newspapers, I kept coming across these different products that were for sale that would make your time in the air raid shelters a little more comfortable. And my favorite was for wall pockets for your shelter. Shorter days possibly mean longer periods in the air raid shelter, so it will be as well to make it as comfortable as possible. Space is an important consideration, so why not have wall pockets in your shelter? They are invaluable for holding all those trifling but important items which make sitting by in the shelter bearable. So thank you again to the movie Blitz, streaming on Apple TV Plus on November 22nd. It's a wonderful film and really makes this period come to life, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.